Let's dive into one of the biggest stories ever told, the story of how the written word was finally set free. We're going to look at how we went from books being these incredibly rare treasures, copied one by hand, to something that you and I can hold in our hands every single day. This is the story of a true revolution.
I mean, just really think about that for a second. Every book you've ever read, every newspaper article, every sign on the street, imagine if each one had to be written out by hand. It wouldn't just be slow, it would be a total chokehold on progress. It meant knowledge was locked away, kept in the hands of a tiny few. The world was just desperate for a breakthrough.
So where does this story start? Well, you might think Europe, but nope, we're actually heading centuries earlier to East Asia. It was China, Japan, and Korea that were the real pioneers of printing. They developed the very first methods to copy texts, and it all started with some incredibly intricate handiwork.
The ingenuity here is just amazing. As early as 594 AD in China, this brilliant new idea came about: woodblock printing. Instead of copying a page word for word, artisans would carve the entire page in reverse onto a block of wood. It was an unbelievably demanding process for sure, but it was humanity's first real step toward mass communication.
So, how did this actually work? Well, it was like a four-step dance of pure precision. First, a craftsman had to painstakingly carve an entire page of text backwards onto a woodblock. Then, they'd brush ink over all the raised letters. After that, they'd press a thin sheet of paper on top and rub it carefully. And when they peeled it away, voila, a perfect copy. One block could make a ton of pages, but man, carving that first one took some serious skill and patience.
Early Chinese printing had some really interesting quirks. The paper they used was so delicate you could only print on one side. So they'd fold the pages and stitch them together, creating this very unique accordion book. And you know what was driving all this innovation? The government. To get a good state job, you had to pass this ridiculously hard civil service exam. So the state actually sponsored the printing of standardized textbooks for the thousands and thousands of people trying to pass.
Now, the idea started to spread, but it was more of a slow burn, happening over centuries. By 868 AD, we see Japan producing the Diamond Sutra, which is actually the world's oldest surviving printed book. Then, around the 11th century, a super crucial ingredient, paper from China, starts its long trip over to Europe. And back in China, by the 1600s, the revolution was pretty much complete. Reading had blossomed from something only scholars did into a popular hobby for everybody.
Okay, so the technology has been around in the East for centuries, but when it finally arrives in Europe, it finds a continent that is absolutely starving for a faster way to spread information and ideas.
And one of the key links between East and West came from explorers like Marco Polo. After a super long journey in China, he came back to Italy with all these stories and all this knowledge about Eastern inventions, including woodblock printing. And just like that, the seed of an idea was planted in European soil.
But Europe had a huge problem. On one hand, the demand for knowledge was just exploding. You had new universities popping up, a growing merchant class that needed to keep records, and more people were learning to read. But the supply? It was stuck in the Dark Ages. Every single book still had to be copied by a scribe by hand. The whole system was at a breaking point. The manuscript system itself was the bottleneck. Books were written on vellum, which is treated animal skin, making them astronomically expensive. A single copy could take a scribe years to finish. And the funny thing is, when the first printed books started to show up, the rich elites kind of looked down their noses at them, calling them cheap vulgarities. The old way was prestigious, sure, but it was also completely broken.
And this is where the hero of our story steps onto the stage. A man who would connect all the dots and create a machine that would literally, and I mean literally, change the world. Johann Gutenberg.
Now, what's so cool about Gutenberg is that he wasn't a scribe or a scholar, he was a goldsmith. And that background, that specific set of skills, turned out to be the perfect combination to solve this massive knowledge problem.
See, his genius wasn't really inventing one thing from scratch. It was combining things that were already out there. He grew up around wine and olive presses, which used this big screw to create a lot of pressure. That became his model. He used his goldsmithing skills to make perfect little molds for individual reusable metal letters. He put the press and the movable type together, and boom, the printing press was born.
And what was the first major book he printed with his new invention? The Bible, of course. In about 3 years, his workshop pumped out 180 copies. Now, that might not sound super fast to us today, but you have to realize, at that time, a single scribe might take 3 years just to produce one single copy. This was an absolute revolution in speed.
So yeah, this wasn't just an improvement, it was a big bang, an explosion. The world was about to be flooded with information on a scale nobody had ever seen before.
Just think about how fast this whole thing took off. In just the first 50 years after Gutenberg, so by the end of the 15th century, Europe was swamped with an estimated, get this, 20 million books.
But that was just the warm-up act. By the end of the next century, that number exploded tenfold. 200 million books. Information was no longer a little trickle, it was a tidal wave. And this flood of books completely rewired society. See, before print, humanity was basically a hearing public. Knowledge was performed, you'd gather round to listen to stories or texts read out loud. But print created a reading public. All of a sudden, you, as an individual, could own a book, read it in silence, and form your own private opinions. It was a massive shift from a collective experience to a deeply personal one.
So in the end, the printing press did way more than just put ink on paper. It put ideas into millions of hands. It fueled the Reformation, the Renaissance, and the scientific revolution. And it leaves us with a question that is just as relevant today as it was 500 years ago. What happens when information is suddenly set free?